The morning sun cast long shadows across the biodomes of New Terra Colony. Children laughed as they ran through the floating gardens, their voices echoing in the clear air. 8-year-old Jehoon pressed his nose against the dome wall, watching cargo ships drift between the orbital platforms above. "Look how they balance the weight," he said to his friend Mina, who was 2 years older and always listened to his engineering observations. "My dad says those ships can carry a whole city." Mina nodded, braiding her long black hair. "My mom says, we might visit Earth next year. She wants to show me the old museums." 7-year-old Do-hyun bounced over to them, his school tablet in hand. "The teacher says we're getting new star maps today, real ones from the exploration ships." The 3 children were typical of New Terra's youth. Born among the stars, they moved easily in the low gravity and spoke casually about interstellar travel. Their parents had come here to build something new, away from Earth's crowded cities. The colony was their success story, peaceful, prosperous, and growing. Above them, something changed. The first ship appeared like a silver needle against the blue sky, then another, and another. Within minutes, a dozen vessels hung in the atmosphere, their hulls gleaming with an alien design that made the human cargo ships look clumsy and primitive. Tae-hyung, Ji-hoon's father, was working in the engineering bay when the alarms started. He dropped his tools and ran to the observation deck. Through the reinforced glass, he could see the ships descending toward the residential domes. "What are those?" asked Seul-gi, Mina's mother. She had rushed from the medical center, still wearing her doctor's coat. "I don't know," Tae-hyung said, but his voice was tight with worry. "They're not responding to our communication attempts." The ships moved with liquid grace, positioning themselves around the colony's most important structures. But they weren't targeting the power plants or the communication arrays. They were surrounding the schools. In the children's biodome, teachers began gathering their students. "Everyone stay calm," called Teacher Park, though her own hands were shaking. "We're going to play a special game today. Everyone needs to stay together." Jehoon grabbed Mina's hand as the dome's emergency lights began flashing. Through the transparent walls, they could see the alien ships getting closer. The vessels were beautiful in a cold way, covered in smooth curves and glowing lines. "They look like sharks," Do-hyun whispered. The first ship settled onto the dome's landing platform with barely a sound. A section of its hull opened, revealing a dark interior. Figures began emerging, tall, slender beings in form-fitting suits that seemed to shift color in the light. The Vexhai had arrived. Their leader stepped forward, moving with the confidence of a species that had done this many times before. Through a translation device, his words reached every human in the dome. "We require specimens for relocation. Cooperation will minimize distress." The teachers pushed the children behind them, forming a protective wall. "This is a human colony under Galactic Council protection," Teacher Park said, trying to keep her voice steady. "You have no authority here." The Vexhai leader tilted his head, studying the humans with large, dark eyes. "Protection protocols do not apply to resource acquisition. These specimens show optimal adaptation characteristics." From the ship, more Vexhai emerged carrying strange devices that hummed with energy. They spread out around the dome's interior, moving with practiced efficiency. "Run!" Teacher Park shouted. Chaos erupted in the dome. Children scattered in all directions while teachers tried to shield them. But the Vexhai were prepared for this. Their devices projected glowing nets of energy that wrapped around anyone they touched. Jehoon saw one of the nets reaching for Mina and pushed her aside. The energy field caught him instead, lifting him off the ground. He struggled against the glowing strands, but they held him tight without causing pain. "Ji-hoon!" Mina screamed, reaching for him. Another net caught her mid-stride. Do-yun tried to hide behind a planter, but the Vex High found him easily. As the net closed around the small boy, tears ran down his face. "I want my mom," he cried. Across the dome, the same scene played out again and again. The aliens worked with cold efficiency, selecting children based on criteria only they understood. They ignored the older teenagers and adults, focusing on those between 6 and 12 years old. Outside, Tai-hyung and the other parents pressed against the dome's emergency barriers, screaming for their children. Security forces had arrived, but their weapons couldn't penetrate the dome without risking the lives of everyone inside. "Do something!" Sulgi shouted at the security chief. "They're taking our babies!" "We can't fire through the dome," the chief replied, his face twisted with frustration. "And those ships have shields we've never seen before." Through the transparent walls, they could only watch as their children were carried toward the alien vessels. The Vexhai moved the captured children with surprising gentleness, as if they were handling valuable cargo. Ji-hoon found himself placed in a holding area inside the ship alongside Mina, Do-yun, and dozens of other children. The walls pulsed with soft light, and the air smelled strange, clean but artificial. "Are they going to hurt us?" Do-hyun asked, his voice small. "I don't think so," Mina said, though she didn't sound sure. "They're being careful with us." Ji-hoon studied their surroundings with his engineer's mind. "This is a cargo area," he said quietly. "But it's designed for living things. See how the walls curve? That's for air circulation." The children huddled together as more victims were brought aboard. Most were crying, but a few remained silent, watching their captors with careful eyes. Outside, the Vexhai finished their collection. In less than an hour, they had taken nearly 200 children from across the colony. The operation had been smooth, efficient, and completely one-sided. As the ships began lifting off, Tae-hyung pressed his hand against the barrier that separated him from his son. Through the ship's viewing ports, he could see Ji-hoon looking back at him. "I'll find you," he whispered, though he knew the boy couldn't hear him. "I promise." The Vexhai fleet gathered in the sky above New Terra, their ships forming a tight formation. For a moment, they hung there like a constellation of artificial stars. Then they activated their hyperspace drives and vanished, taking the children with them into the vast darkness between worlds. In the sudden silence that followed, the adults of New Terra stood in shock. They had been helpless to protect their most precious treasures. But as the initial numbness wore off, something else began to build in its place. Something the Vexhai had never encountered before. Something that would follow them across the galaxy. The hunt was about to begin. The message reached Earth 18 hours after the attack on New Terra. Admiral Hyunwoo was having his morning coffee when the priority alert flashed across his personal screen. He nearly dropped the cup as he read the report. 200 children gone. The words seemed impossible. In the 3 centuries since humanity had spread among the stars, nothing like this had ever happened. Pirates occasionally attacked cargo ships, and there were territorial disputes with other species, but taking human children? That was unthinkable. Within minutes, Hyunwoo was in the command center of Luna Station, Earth's primary military hub. Officers rushed around him, pulling up star charts and communication logs. The normally calm atmosphere had been replaced by barely controlled urgency. What do we know about these Vex High? Hyunwoo asked his intelligence chief. Sophisticated. Slavers, came the reply. They operate on the outer rim, targeting primitive species for the labor markets. But they've never touched a Galactic Council member before. We're not just any council member, Hyunwoo said quietly. His voice carried a tone that made everyone in the room stop and listen. We're humans, and they took our children. The Admiral's words spread through the station like ripples in a pond. Staff members began making personal calls. Within hours, the news had reached every human world, every deep space station, every freight convoy drifting between the stars. The reaction was immediate and unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. On the mining world of Kepler 7th, freight. Captain Jinwoo was loading rare earth metals when the news reached him. He had been planning a profitable run to the inner systems, but as he read the report, profit became irrelevant. Change of plans, he told his crew. We're going hunting. His first officer, a practical man named Wushik, shook his head. Captain, we're just a cargo hauler. We don't have weapons. We don't have military training. What can we do against professional slavers? Jinwoo looked at his friend with eyes that had gone cold. We find them, and then we make them pay. Across human space, similar conversations were happening. Dr. Yuna, a xenobiologist studying alien life forms on the research station Babylon, abandoned her work and booked passage on the first ship heading toward the outer rim. Her credentials got her access to the investigation files, and what she read made her sick. The Vexhai had been watching human colonies for months, studying their children like livestock. They had chosen New Terra because it was isolated and peaceful. They thought humans would be easy targets. They were about to learn how wrong they could be. Sunho worked in the shadows of the Galactic Information Network. Officially, he was a data analyst for a shipping company. Unofficially, he could slice through alien security systems like a hot knife through butter. When the news of New Terra reached him, he immediately began hunting for digital traces of the Vexhai fleet. It took him 6 hours to find their trail. The slavers had thought they were being clever, using quantum encryption and randomized jump patterns. But they had made one mistake. They were still broadcasting to their buyers, letting potential customers know about their new inventory. The advertisements made Sunho's blood boil. Adaptable specimens, they called the children. High problem-solving capability. Excellent for technical labor or domestic service. He copied the data and sent it to every human intelligence network he could find. Then he started working on something more personal. If the Vexhai wanted to use quantum networks, he was going to make sure they regretted it. The response from Earth's government was swift, but not swift enough for most humans. President Kim called for economic sanctions and diplomatic pressure. The Galactic Council promised to investigate and consider appropriate responses. But out in space, away from politicians and bureaucrats, something else was building. Ships began changing course without official orders. Cargo haulers, research vessels, even luxury liners started heading toward the outer rim. Their crews and passengers had one thing in common. They were human. And somewhere out there, human. Children were in danger. Captain Jinwoo's converted freighter was the first to reach the New Terra system. He found it surrounded by Galactic Council patrol ships, their crews taking statements and gathering evidence. The bureaucratic process would take months. Jinwoo didn't have months. He landed on New Terra and sought out the parents of the taken children. He found Taehyung in the engineering bay, staring at a holographic display that showed the Vexhai ship's departure trajectory. The man looked like he hadn't slept since his son was taken. "I'm Captain Jinwoo," he said simply. I'm here to help you get your boy back. Taehyung looked up with hollow eyes. The council ships say they're investigating. They tell us to be patient, to let the process work. The process won't bring Jihoon home, Jinwoo said. But we might. For the first time since the attack, hope flickered in Taehyung's expression. What do you mean? I mean, I've got a ship and I know people. People who understand that when someone takes your family, you don't wait for committees and diplomatic notes. You go get them back. Solgi entered the bay, having overheard the conversation. Mina's mother looked exhausted but determined. If you're going after them, I'm coming with you. I'm a doctor. The children might need medical care. This won't be a rescue mission, Jinwoo warned. This will be war. Then we'd better win it, Seolgi replied. Across the galaxy, the word spread through channels the Galactic Council didn't even know existed. Human traders talked to human miners. Human researchers shared data with human explorers. Military veterans reached out to old comrades who had settled on frontier worlds. What the galaxy was witnessing wasn't just anger over a single attack. It was the awakening of something that had been sleeping in human space. The tribal instinct that had carried humanity from African plains to the stars. The understanding that an attack on human children was an attack on the entire species. Dr. Yuna arrived at New Terra 2 days after Jinwoo. She brought with her detailed files on Vex High biology and psychology, gathered from years of studying alien species. Her findings were disturbing. They don't see the children as people, she explained to the growing group of volunteers. To them, humans are just another resource to be harvested. They've done this to dozens of other species. But they've never done it to humans before, Jinwoo said. They don't know us. What don't they know? Taehyung asked. Jinwoo smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. They don't know that we never give up. They don't know that we hold grudges. And they sure as hell don't know what happens when you threaten human children. By the end of the week, over 300 ships had gathered at New Terra. They came from every corner of human space, merchants and miners, scientists and soldiers, diplomats and drifters. Most had never met before, but they were united by something stronger than friendship or duty. They were united by the knowledge that somewhere in the darkness between stars, human children were afraid and alone. The hunt was about to begin in earnest, and the galaxy would never be the same. News of the New Terra incident spread through human space like a virus, but unlike a disease that weakened its hosts, this information made humans stronger, more connected, more dangerous. Minji was 3 days out from Titan Station when the message reached her cargo ship. She had been looking forward to a profitable run. Her hold was full of rare crystals that would fetch premium prices in the inner systems. The kind of cargo that could set her up for months. She read the report twice, then called her navigator to the bridge. "Set course for New Terra," she ordered. "Captain, that'll add 2 weeks to our journey. The crystals have a delivery deadline." Minji looked at the image attached to the report, school photos of the missing children. Their faces were so young, so trusting. "Dump the cargo. Ma'am, you heard me. Dump the crystals. We're going to need the space for supplies and people." Her navigator stared at her. "That's 250,000 credits floating in space." "Those are human children in chains somewhere," Minji replied. "Money we can make again, but those kids..." She paused, thinking of her own younger brothers back on Earth. "Those kids only get one childhood. Across the galaxy, similar decisions were being made." On the mining station, Ross 447, Administrator Jimin received the bulletin during his morning briefing. He had been planning to expand the operation, add 3 new drilling sites that would double their output. Instead, he sent a message to every human ship in the sector. Ross 447 is now a supply depot for New Terra operations. Free fuel, food, and repairs for any vessel joining the search. His board of directors was furious. The company would lose millions in production and resources. But Jamin had grown up in an orphanage, and the thought of children being sold like property made him physically sick. "If you don't like it, fire me," he told the board. "But this station is going to help bring those kids home." The transformation happening across human space bewildered other species. Ambassador Zelthan of the Rigel Collective had been monitoring human communications since the New Terra incident. The patterns he saw made no sense from a logical standpoint. Humans were abandoning profitable ventures. They were converting civilian ships into search vessels. They were sharing resources freely with people they had never met. All for children who weren't even their own offspring. "It's economically irrational," he reported to his superiors. "They're damaging their own trade networks and industrial capacity. For what? A few hundred juveniles?" But other species were starting to understand something the Rigel Collective couldn't grasp. The Vexhi hadn't just attacked one human colony. They had threatened the one thing that every human, regardless of world or politics or personal beliefs, held sacred: their children. Diplomat Hana was attending a trade conference on Nexus Prime when the news broke. She had been negotiating a complex mineral rights deal that would benefit 3 different human colonies. It was delicate work that had taken months to set up. She walked out of the negotiations halfway through, leaving her counterparts confused and angry. "Where are you going?" demanded the trade representative from Centauri Corp. "To find some children," Hana said simply. She used every diplomatic contact she had built over 15 years of service. Old favors were called in. Debts were collected. Information networks that had been carefully cultivated for trade purposes were suddenly repurposed for hunting slavers. Within days, Hana had assembled a detailed picture of Vexhi operations throughout the sector. Their supply chains, their buyers, their safe harbors. Information that would have taken military intelligence weeks to gather. The Galactic Council was growing concerned. Ambassador Veltar of the Hegemony had called for an emergency session to discuss what they were calling the human overreaction. "This kind of uncontrolled response threatens galactic stability," he declared to the assembled delegates. "They're mobilizing civilian populations for what amounts to a military campaign. It's unprecedented and dangerous." Other ambassadors nodded in agreement. The humans were disrupting established procedures, ignoring diplomatic channels, and worst of all, they were doing it with frightening efficiency. But some delegates saw the situation differently. Ambassador Korath of the Terran-friendly Drakmir spoke up during the session. "Perhaps," he suggested carefully, "the concern should not be with human efficiency, but with what drove them to this point. The Vexhi violated one of our most basic principles, the protection of the young." "The humans signed the Galactic Accords," Veltar replied coldly. "They agreed to work within established systems." "And when those systems fail?" Korath asked. "When bureaucracy moves too slowly to save children from slavers? What then?" The chamber fell silent. Most delegates preferred not to think about such uncomfortable questions. Meanwhile, the human network continued to grow. On the frontier world of New Brisbane, former military officer Junho received a coded message from his old unit commander. It contained a single line: "The children need you." Junho had been trying to forget his military past, to build a quiet life as a farmer. But some things, once learned, could never be unlearned. Within hours, he was packing equipment that he had hoped never to use again. Weapons, surveillance gear, the tools of war. On the academic world of New Cambridge, Professor Kiori was lecturing on xenopsychology when a student interrupted with breaking news about New Terra. The professor stopped mid-sentence and stared at the images of the missing children. "Class dismissed," she said quietly. That evening, Kiori sent a message to every xenobiologist in human space. "We need everything we know about Vex High Society. Their weaknesses, their fears, their pressure points. These creatures think they can treat human children like livestock. Let's show them what happens when you threaten a species that remembers how to hate." The response was overwhelming. Within days, Kiori had assembled the most complete psychological profile of the Vex High that had ever existed. It painted a picture of a species that relied on intimidation and superior technology to dominate their victims. But they had never faced victims who fought back with such determination. Back at New Terra, Captain Jinwoo watched the growing fleet with satisfaction and concern. Ships arrived daily, cargo haulers retrofitted with weapons, research vessels loaded with scanning equipment, even luxury yachts, whose owners had decided that hunting slavers was more important than comfort. The problem wasn't finding volunteers. The problem was organizing them. "We need a plan," Dr. Yuna said during one of their planning sessions. "This many ships, this many people, we could do a lot of damage if we coordinate properly." "Or get a lot of people killed if we don't," added Soon-Ho, looking up from his computer displays. He had been tracking Vex High communications for days, mapping their network. Tai-Young, who had barely left the command center since his son was taken, spoke up. "What does it matter? Those monsters have our children. Every day we wait, every hour we spend planning, they're getting further away." Seulgi put a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Taehyung, I want Mina back just as much as you want Jihoon back. But if we charge in without thinking, we might never see them again." The room fell quiet as the weight of their responsibility settled on them. They weren't just planning a rescue anymore. They were planning a war that could reshape how the galaxy thought about human civilization. And somewhere in the darkness between stars, the Vex High were beginning to realize that taking human children had been the worst mistake they had ever made. The network was awake, the hunt was organized, and humanity was coming. The cargo hold of the Vex High vessel hummed with alien technology. Soft lights pulsed along the walls in patterns that hurt human eyes to watch. The air tasted metallic and strange, filtered through systems designed for different lungs. But the 200 human children held in the ship's belly were adapting faster than their captors had expected. Jihoon sat in what had become the unofficial leadership circle, his 8-year-old mind working through the ship's systems with the methodical approach his engineer father had taught him. The holding area wasn't a prison in the traditional sense. It was more like a comfortable waiting room with invisible barriers that prevented them from leaving. "The lights follow a pattern," he explained to Mina and Do-hyun in a whisper. "Watch. Bright for 47 seconds, dim for 13 seconds, then the blue pulse. It's not random." Mina, at 10 years old, had become the unofficial organizer of their group. While the adults back home were planning rescue missions, she was managing resources and keeping morale up among 200 scared children. "Save your food packets," she told a group of younger kids. "We don't know when they'll give us more. And drink water slowly. Just sips. It needs to last." 7-year-old Do-hyun had surprised everyone by becoming their scout and intelligence gatherer. His small size let him crawl through maintenance spaces that the older children couldn't fit through. More importantly, his natural curiosity made him brave enough to explore areas that terrified the others. "I found where they keep the ship controls," he reported during one of their quiet planning sessions. "There are 3 Vex high up there, and they have these floating screens with symbols on them." The Vex high had expected the human children to behave like other species they had captured. Most young prisoners became withdrawn and passive within days, making them easy to manage during transport. But human children seemed to grow more organized and determined as time passed. Captain Zephyk studied the surveillance feeds with growing unease. His ship was equipped with the finest containment systems in the sector, designed to hold specimens safely during transport to the slave markets. But these human juveniles were testing every system he had. "They're mapping our ship," his first officer reported. "The small one has accessed 7 different maintenance areas. The female is organizing them into groups with specific tasks, and the male—" He paused, checking his notes. "The male is attempting to understand our life support systems." Zephyk felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ship's climate control. How is that possible? They're children. Human children, apparently, are different from our previous subjects. Indeed, they were. While children from other species might cry for their parents or retreat into themselves, the human children had formed what could only be described as a resistance cell. 12-year-old Somin had taken charge of the older children. She had been on New Terra visiting her grandparents when the attack happened. Back on Earth, she was known as a quiet, bookish girl who preferred reading to playing games. But faced with captivity, she discovered leadership skills she never knew she possessed. "We need to know everything about this ship," she told her group. "How it works, where it's going, how many guards there are. Information is our weapon." 9-year-old Hyun became their communications specialist. He had noticed that the Vex High spoke to each other in their own language, but their computer systems used universal trade symbols that any spacer's child would recognize. "That symbol means fuel," he explained to the others, pointing to markings he had memorized from Do-hyun's scouting trips. "That one is navigation, and this—" He traced another symbol in the air. "This one means destination." The children's behavior was so unexpected that the Vex High began to worry about their cargo's value. Buyers in the slave markets preferred docile, broken subjects who wouldn't cause trouble for their new owners. These human children showed no signs of breaking. "Perhaps we should increase the sedation," suggested the ship's medic. "No," Zephyk replied. "The contracts specify that specimens must be undamaged. Excessive drugs would lower their market value." But as days passed, the children's resistance only grew stronger. They had established a complex social structure with lookouts, messengers, and planners. They shared resources equally and looked after the youngest members of their group with touching dedication. 6-year-old Ariam was the baby of their group, and she had become everyone's little sister. The older children took turns comforting her when she cried for her parents, sharing their food rations with her, and telling her stories to help her sleep. "My daddy will come get us," she said one night, her small voice carrying absolute faith. "All our daddies will come," Mina assured her, though privately she wondered if that was true. Space was big, and they had been traveling for days without any sign of pursuit. But Jihoon had been thinking about the problem differently. "My dad always says that the hardest part of fixing something is figuring out what's actually broken," he told Mina during one of their whispered conferences. "Maybe we don't need to wait for rescue. Maybe we need to rescue ourselves." "How?" Mina asked. Jihoon looked around the holding area, his young mind seeing possibilities that his captors had never considered. We learn how their ship works. We find their weaknesses. And when the time is right, we show them that human children aren't as helpless as they think. The plan that began forming was ambitious and dangerous. It would require perfect timing, absolute trust between the children, and more courage than anyone should expect from kids their age. But these weren't ordinary children. They were human. Children raised on stories of exploration and adventure, taught from birth that problems existed to be solved and obstacles existed to be overcome. Do-hyun continued his scouting missions, mapping the ship's layout and learning the routines of their guards. Hyun worked on understanding the Vex-High computer systems, memorizing symbols and interface patterns. Somin organized the older children into teams with specific roles. And Mina began what might have been the most important job of all. She kept hope alive. Remember, she told the group during their daily meetings, we're not just prisoners. We're humans. And humans don't give up. The Vex-High crew was beginning to realize that they had made a serious miscalculation. These weren't passive victims waiting to be sold. These were humans. Young, small, technically still children, but humans nonetheless. And humans, as the galaxy was learning, were dangerous no matter what age they were. The children had no way of knowing that across human space, an unprecedented rescue operation was being organized. They couldn't know that hundreds of ships were converging on their last known position, or that their parents were coming for them with the fury of a species that had never learned to abandon its young. All they knew was that they were far from home, in the hands of creatures who saw them as property, and that if they wanted to see their families again, they would have to fight for it. So they prepared to fight, because that's what humans do. The fleet that assembled at New Terra was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Over 400 ships of every size and design floated in loose formation around the colony. Cargo haulers bristled with hastily mounted weapons. Research vessels hummed with scanning equipment. Even luxury yachts had been converted into command ships. Captain Jinwoo stood on the bridge of his converted freighter, now the unofficial flagship of the human armada. Through the viewports, he could see the organized chaos of preparation. Ships took on supplies, crews shared information, and volunteers transferred between vessels to form mixed combat teams. "We're as ready as we'll ever be," reported Sun Ho, from his position at the communication station. His equipment was far more sophisticated than anything that belonged on a cargo ship. Over the past week, he had turned Jinwoo's vessel into a mobile intelligence center. Dr. Yuna looked up from her research files. "I've finished the analysis of Vex-High psychology and tactics. They're hunters, but they've always preyed on isolated, defenseless targets. They've never faced organized resistance." "What does that mean for us?" asked Taehyung. Jihoon's father had barely slept since joining the fleet, spending his time studying ship schematics and weapon systems. "It means they won't expect what we're planning," Yuna replied. "But it also means they'll be dangerous when cornered. Desperate predators are the most unpredictable." Sulgi was tending to a young volunteer who had been injured during weapons training. At 53, she was one of the older members of the rescue fleet, but her medical skills made her invaluable. "How many children are we going after?" she asked. 200 from New Terra," Jinwoo said. "But Sunho's intelligence suggests there might be others." Sunho nodded grimly. "The Vex-High have been operating for years. Based on their communication patterns, they're holding juveniles from at least 6 different species. Humans are just their latest victims." The revelation had changed the nature of their mission. What had started as a rescue operation had become something larger, a campaign to destroy an entire slave trade network. On the mining station Ross 447, Jamin was coordinating supply runs for the growing fleet. His station had become a hub of activity, with ships arriving daily for fuel and equipment. The corporate board had finally voted to remove him as administrator, but Jamin ignored the order. "You can fire me when this is over," he told his assistant. "Right now, those kids need everything we can give them." The transformation happening across human space continued to baffle other species. Ambassador Veltar of the Hegemony had been monitoring human communications for days, trying to understand their response patterns. "They're not operating through normal command structures," he reported to the Galactic Council. "Civilian authorities seem to have lost control of their population. Individual humans are making decisions that should require government approval." "Is it a revolution?" asked another delegate. "No," Veltar replied slowly. "It's something else, something we've never seen before. They're organizing spontaneously, around a single goal: recovering their offspring." What the Council couldn't grasp was the fundamental difference in human social structure. While other species relied on rigid hierarchies and formal authority, humans had retained the ability to form cooperative groups based on shared purpose rather than official command. The Hunt Fleet was living proof of this ability. Captain Minji had arrived from the Outer Rim with her cargo holds full of volunteers and equipment. Former military personnel, off-duty security officers, engineers, doctors, anyone with skills that might help bring the children home. "I've got 37 volunteers with combat experience," she reported to Jinwoo during the daily coordination meeting. "Plus a full medical team and enough supplies to support a month-long operation." Similar reports came in from other ships. The human response wasn't just about firepower. It was about bringing every possible resource to bear on the problem. Diplomat Hana had spent days working her contacts throughout the galaxy. Her efforts had produced detailed intelligence on Vex High, operations including the location of their primary slave market, Kepler Station, she announced to the assembled captains. "It's technically neutral territory, but everyone knows it's where the illegal trade happens. If we want to find our children, that's where we start." "It's heavily defended," warned a former military officer named Chang Ho. "Station security, private guards, automated defense systems, and that's before we deal with the criminal organizations that operate there." Jinwoo studied the tactical display showing Kepler Station's defenses. "How many civilians are on that station?" "Nearly 500,000, Hana replied. "Traders, tourists, residents, a lot of innocent people." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the implications. A direct assault would result in massive civilian casualties, something that went against every human moral principle. "We go in quiet," Jinwoo decided. "Scout teams first, then precision strikes. We save our children without harming innocents." "That makes it 10 times harder," Chang Ho pointed out. "Then we'd better be 10 times smarter," Seulgi said firmly. "Those children are counting on us to do this right." Meanwhile, Sun Ho had made a breakthrough in his intelligence gathering. The Vex High were using quantum-encrypted communications, but they had a weakness. They were still selling their prisoners through normal commercial channels. "I've intercepted auction announcements," he reported. "They're advertising the human children as premium specimens with exceptional adaptability. The sale is scheduled for 6 days from now." 6 days. The fleet would have to cover hundreds of light years, infiltrate one of the galaxy's most dangerous criminal hubs, locate the children among thousands of prisoners, and extract them safely, all while avoiding a war that could destroy everything they were trying to protect. "It's not enough time," Chang Ho said. "It's the time we have," Jinwoo replied. "We'll make it work." The fleet began moving within hours. Ships jumped to hyperspace in small groups, using different routes to avoid detection. They would rendezvous near Kepler Station and begin the most dangerous phase of their mission. As his ship entered hyperspace, Tae-hyung stared out at the swirling patterns of compressed space-time. Somewhere in this vast universe, his son was trapped on an alien ship, probably scared and homesick. "Hold on, Jahoon," he whispered. "Daddy's coming." Across the fleet, similar scenes were playing out. Parents thinking of their children, volunteers remembering why they had abandoned their normal lives for this desperate mission, crews preparing for a battle that would determine the fate of 200 innocent kids. The Vex-High had thought they were taking helpless victims. Instead, they had awakened something that had been sleeping in the human soul for too long: the absolute, uncompromising determination to protect their young. The hunt was no longer just beginning. It was racing toward its target at faster-than-light speed, carrying with it the fury of an entire species, and the galaxy was about to discover what humans were truly capable of when their children were threatened. The ships jumped through hyperspace, like avenging angels, carrying fire and determination toward the darkness where innocence was being sold. The reckoning was coming. Kepler Station hung in space like a metallic flower, its petals formed by massive docking arms that could accommodate everything from single-person shuttles to kilometer-long freight haulers. The station rotated slowly, generating artificial gravity for its 500,000 residents and countless visitors. To most travelers, it looked like a thriving commercial hub. But beneath its legitimate business exterior, Kepler Station housed one of the galaxy's largest illegal markets. Slaves, drugs, weapons, stolen technology. If it was forbidden elsewhere, it could be bought here. The Vex-High transport ship approached the station with routine confidence. Captain Zefik had made this journey dozens of times before. He expected the usual delays, bribes, and paperwork that came with doing business on Kepler Station. He did not expect the trap that was waiting for him. 2 days earlier, Captain Minji had arrived at the station posing as a mineral trader. Her ship's cargo holds were indeed full of rare crystals. She had dumped her original load and bought a new one specifically to support her cover identity. "Docking Bay 73, she told the station controller, using credentials that Sunho had carefully forged. "I have a shipment of Rigel crystals for the Zentari Mining Consortium." The station's automated systems cleared her without question. Within hours, she was walking the corridors of Kepler Station, studying its layout and identifying key systems. The place was exactly as bad as she had expected. In the public areas, legitimate businesses operated alongside barely concealed criminal enterprises. In the private sections, she knew, much worse things were happening. But Minji wasn't alone. Diplomat Hana had arrived 3 days before her, using her official credentials to gain access to the station's commercial databases. She posed as a trade representative investigating new markets for human goods. What she found made her sick to her stomach. The slave auctions were held in a section of the station euphemistically called the Employment District. Sophisticated. Scanning systems prevented weapons from entering the area, and private security forces kept order with brutal efficiency. "It's worse than we thought," she reported to the fleet through encrypted channels. "They're not just selling children. There are hundreds of prisoners from dozens of species. Some of them have been here for months." The information changed their mission parameters. They weren't just rescuing human children. They were breaking up an entire slave market that had operated with impunity for years. Captain Jinwoo's fleet began arriving in the system 12 hours before the scheduled auction. The ships came in small groups, using different approach vectors and false identification codes that Sunho had prepared. To station security, they looked like ordinary commercial traffic, but in the cargo holds and passenger compartments, teams of volunteers were making final preparations for the most complex rescue operation in human history. Aboard the HFY. Transport. The human children had spent days preparing for their own part in the plan they didn't know existed. Jihoon had mapped every system he could access, while Mina had organized the children into groups that could move quickly and quietly when the time came. "Remember," she told the older kids during their final planning session, "when things start happening, stay together and follow the plan. Look after the little ones." Do-Yan had become their intelligence specialist, reporting on guard routines and ship activities. "The tall one with the scars checks on us every 4 hours," he whispered. "The other two only come down here when they're bringing food." The children had no idea that rescue was coming, but they had prepared themselves to take advantage of any opportunity that presented itself. Their captors had drastically underestimated human adaptability and determination, even in children, as the HFY ship docked with Kepler Station. Captain Zephyk reviewed the auction preparations. The human children would be the star attraction of the evening's sale. Buyers throughout the sector had expressed interest in these unusual specimens. Biological. "Scans confirm optimal health in all subjects," his medical officer reported. "No signs of the psychological breakdown we typically see in captured juveniles." "Excellent," Zephyk replied. "Higher prices for premium merchandise." What he didn't know was that the auction house's security systems had been compromised. Sunho had spent 2 days infiltrating their networks, learning their procedures and identifying vulnerabilities. "I can disable their internal scanners for exactly 17 minutes, he reported to the assault teams. "After that, their backup systems will activate and you'll be fighting blind. 17 minutes to locate and extract 200 children from a heavily guarded facility in the middle of a criminal haven." The odds were impossible, but the humans had stopped caring about odds days ago. The auction began at local midnight, when most of the station's legitimate businesses were closed and the criminal elements could operate more openly. Wealthy buyers from across the galaxy attended, their identities hidden behind masks and voice modulators. The first lots were adults from various species, skilled technicians, domestic servants, entertainment slaves. The bidding was brisk but routine. Then the auctioneer announced the evening's special attraction. "Lot 47 through Lot 246, he announced. "Human juveniles, ages 6 through 12, exceptional adaptability and problem-solving skills. Minimum bid, 50,000 credits each." The children were brought onto the auction platform in groups of 10. They walked with dignity, despite their fear, holding hands and staying close together exactly as Mina had trained them. In the audience, buyers leaned forward with interest. Human slaves were rare, and human children were almost unheard of. The bidding started immediately and rose quickly, but in the shadows around the auction house, other figures were moving with deadly purpose. The assault began exactly as planned. Security systems throughout the auction district suddenly went dark. Emergency lighting activated, bathing everything in red shadows that made it hard to see clearly. In the confusion, teams of humans appeared as if from nowhere. They wore dark clothing and moved with military precision, their faces covered, but their purpose unmistakable. "This is a rescue operation," announced a voice over the station's communication system. "Release the prisoners and no one gets hurt." The crime boss who controlled this section of Kepler Station was a hegemony alien named Thexel. He had built his empire by being smarter and more ruthless than his competitors. But he had never faced anything like this coordinated assault. Deploy all security teams, he ordered from his command center. Kill the intruders and protect the merchandise. But the humans weren't fighting like typical rescue teams. They moved with the desperation of parents and the skill of trained soldiers. More importantly, they seemed to know exactly where they were going and what they were looking for. On the auction platform, Jihoon heard the sounds of battle and saw his chance. "Now!" he shouted to the other children. What happened next would become legend in criminal circles throughout the galaxy. 200 human children, ranging in age from 6 to 12, executed a coordinated escape plan that they had developed and rehearsed during their captivity. The older children formed protective groups around the younger ones. They moved in, formations that their captors had never seen before, not random panic, but organized resistance that would have impressed military strategists. Mina led one group toward an emergency exit that Do-Yun had scouted days earlier. Soman took another group in the opposite direction, creating confusion among the guards. The youngest children, led by little Areum, crawled through maintenance spaces too small for adults to follow. In the chaos of the rescue operation, the children's rebellion created enough confusion for the human assault teams to reach them. Parents and volunteers fought through corridors filled with smoke and gunfire, driven by desperation and love. Taehyung found Jihoon leading a group of 6 other children toward what he hoped was safety. Father and son locked eyes across the burning auction house, and both broke into smiles despite the danger around them. "Dad!" Jihoon shouted, running toward his father. "I told you I'd come for you," Taehyung said, scooping his son into his arms. Similar. Reunions were happening throughout the complex as the rescue teams located their targets, but the mission wasn't over. They still had to escape from a heavily defended criminal station with hundreds of prisoners in tow. The extraction phase began as alarms wailed throughout Kepler Station. The humans had planned for this too, using their converted ships to provide covering fire while evacuation shuttles ferried rescued prisoners to safety. Crime boss Thexel watched his empire crumble in less than an hour. The humans had struck with surgical precision, targeting only the slave markets and leaving the rest of his operations intact. But they had made their point with devastating clarity. "Who are these people?" he demanded. "Humans," his intelligence chief replied. "The same species whose children we've been selling." For the first time in decades, Thexel felt genuine fear. He had built his power by understanding the weaknesses of other species. But these humans didn't seem to have any weaknesses. That mattered. They had crossed the galaxy to recover their young, and nothing was going to stop them. The battle for Kepler Station was swift and surgical, but the war was far from over. As rescue shuttles ferried freed prisoners to safety, Captain Jinwoo stood in the command center of his converted freighter, studying tactical displays that showed the larger scope of their mission. "How many Vexi ships escaped the station?" he asked Soon-Ho. 12 vessels fled when the shooting started, came the reply. "But I've been tracking their communications. They're regrouping at a facility in the outer spiral, some kind of processing center, where they prepare prisoners for different markets." Dr. Yuna looked up from her medical reports. The rescued children were physically healthy but emotionally traumatized. Many had witnessed things no child should ever see. "If there's a central facility, there could be thousands more prisoners there." Admiral Hyunwoo's voice crackled over the communication system from his flagship. "The defense fleet is 3 hours out. We can provide heavy support for a direct assault." "No," Jinwoo said firmly. "This isn't a military operation anymore. It's personal." Around the galaxy, news of the Kepler station rescue had spread like wildfire. The images were stark and powerful. Human parents embracing children they thought they'd lost forever, hundreds of alien prisoners freed from cages, and the smoldering wreckage of facilities that had operated with impunity for years. But the reaction wasn't universal celebration. In the halls of government and corporate boardrooms, a different conversation was taking place. Ambassador Veltar of the Hegemony called an emergency session of the Galactic Council. The humans have violated every principle of civilized behavior, he declared to the assembled delegates. They launched an unauthorized military assault on neutral territory. They destroyed property worth millions of credits. This cannot stand. Other delegates murmured agreement. The humans had broken protocols, ignored diplomatic channels, and used force to solve a problem that should have been handled through proper legal procedures. But Ambassador Korath of the Drakmir spoke up with a different perspective. Perhaps we should ask ourselves why the humans felt compelled to act outside normal channels. How long have we known about the slave markets on Kepler Station? How many reports have we filed? How many committee meetings have we held? The chamber fell silent. Everyone knew the answer. The Galactic Council had been aware of illegal slavery for decades, but had always found reasons to delay action. Too much paperwork. Not enough evidence. Jurisdictional disputes. Political complications. Meanwhile, children had been sold like livestock. The humans achieved in 1 week what we have failed to accomplish in 30 years, Korath continued. Perhaps it is we who should be examining our procedures. Back in the outer spiral, the human fleet had grown to over 600 ships. Word of the successful rescue had brought more volunteers from across human space. Engineers, doctors, soldiers, traders, anyone with skills that might help finish what they had started. The Vex-High processing facility was a nightmare made real. Built inside a hollowed-out asteroid, it contained thousands of cells, medical, laboratories, and training facilities where prisoners were conditioned for sale. The children rescued from Kepler Station had been lucky. They were too new to be processed. The prisoners who had been there longer were in much worse condition. Captain Zephyk paced the control center of his facility, studying reports from across his network. The human assault on Kepler Station had been devastating, but it might have been an isolated incident. Surely no species would be crazy enough to declare war on the entire slave trade. Sir, his communications officer reported, we're receiving distress signals from facilities throughout the sector. Human ships are attacking our operations everywhere. Zephyk felt his stomach drop. It wasn't an isolated incident. It was a coordinated campaign. How many facilities have been hit? 17 confirmed destroyed, 12 more under attack. They're not just freeing prisoners. They're completely dismantling our infrastructure. The scope of the human response was beyond anything the Vex-High had imagined. This wasn't a rescue mission anymore. It was genocide, the systematic destruction of their entire civilization. Aboard Jinwu's flagship, the mood was grim but determined. Intelligence reports showed that the Vex-High had been operating for over 2 centuries, capturing and selling members of dozens of different species. The scale of their crimes was staggering. We're not just fighting for our children anymore, Sulgi said during a strategy meeting. We're fighting for every child who was ever taken by these monsters. Taehyung held Jihoon close as they reviewed the tactical displays. His son had insisted on staying for the final assault, saying that the other rescued children deserved to see their captors brought to justice. Are you sure about this? Taehyung asked his boy. Jihoon nodded seriously. his 8-year-old face, showed a maturity that no child should have to develop. They need to see that we won, that we didn't give up. The assault on the HFY processing facility began at dawn, local time. But this time it wasn't just humans attacking. Ships from a dozen other species had joined the fleet. Parents whose children had been taken years earlier. Governments that had been too weak to act alone. Even some criminal organizations that saw an opportunity to eliminate competition. The humans had started something that was spreading across the galaxy. The facility's defenses were formidable. Automated weapon systems, shield generators, and a private fleet of warships protected the asteroid base. But the attackers had advantages the defenders couldn't counter. They fought with the fury of parents and the support of an entire network of civilizations that had finally said, enough. The battle raged for 6 hours. In the command center, Captain Zefik watched his empire crumble one system at a time. His ships were destroyed, his defenses breached, and his facility overrun by enemies who showed no mercy to slavers. Surrender protocols are being broadcast, his communications officer reported. Should we respond? Zefik looked at the tactical display. His fleet was gone, his facility was lost, and rescue teams were already freeing prisoners from the deepest cells. There was no point in continuing a fight he had already lost. No, he said quietly. Let them come. The liberation of the processing facility revealed the full horror of the HFY operation. Thousands of prisoners from dozens of species were found in conditions that defied description. Some had been held for years, broken and conditioned for sale. Others were recent captures who still had hope in their eyes. The human rescue teams worked alongside medical personnel from other species to treat the survivors. Dr. Yuna found herself coordinating care for children who spoke languages she didn't recognize, but whose trauma was universal. How many? She asked one of her colleagues. Over 3,000 prisoners total, came the reply. About 400 are children. The rest. He shook his head. Some of them may never recover. But recovery would have to wait. As the last prisoners were evacuated from the facility, intelligence teams made a discovery that changed everything. The HFY hadn't been working alone. Financial records showed payments from dozens of legitimate corporations and governments throughout the galaxy. The slave trade wasn't just a criminal enterprise, it was a business supported by some of the most respectable organizations in known space. They were selling children to mining companies for dangerous work, Sunho reported, his face pale with disgust. Entertainment corporations bought them for... I can't even read some of these contracts. Captain Jinwoo studied the data with growing anger. Give me a list of every organization that bought prisoners. Every company, every government, every individual. Sir, that's hundreds of entities. Some of them are Galactic Council members. I don't care, Jinwoo replied. They bought stolen children. They're going to answer for it. As news of the facility's liberation spread, something unprecedented happened across human space. Corporations that had unknowingly bought products made with slave labor immediately severed their contracts. Governments passed emergency legislation banning trade with any organization connected to the slave markets. Private citizens organized boycotts that brought entire industries to their knees. The message was clear: humanity would not tolerate slavery in any form, and anyone who supported it would face the consequences. But the humans weren't done yet. Captain Zefik and his surviving crew were captured and placed in holding cells, the same cells where they had kept their victims. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. What happens to them now? Asked one of the rescue volunteers. Jinwoo looked at the captured slavers with cold eyes. They faced justice, human justice. The war against the slave trade was entering its final phase. The criminals were captured, their facilities destroyed, and their network dismantled. But the humans had learned something important during their campaign. They had learned that when they worked together, when they put aside their differences and focused on a common goal, they could accomplish anything, even changing the galaxy itself. The hunt was almost over, but the real work, building a galaxy where no child would ever be stolen again, was just beginning. 6 months after the liberation of the Vex High processing facility, the galaxy looked very different than it had before 200 human children were taken from New Terra. The Galactic Council chambers on Nexus Prime buzzed with activity as delegates from hundreds of worlds debated the most comprehensive anti-slavery legislation in galactic history. But the usual political maneuvering was absent. Everyone had seen the images from Kepler Station and the processing facility. Everyone knew what could happen to species that tolerated the trafficking of children. Ambassador Veltar of the Hegemony sat in stunned silence as the voting concluded. The Universal Child Protection Act had passed by an overwhelming margin, 847 votes in favor, 12 against, with 23 abstentions. It was the most unified the Council had been in over a century. "The motion is carried," announced the Council President. "All member species commit to the immediate elimination of child trafficking within their territories. Enforcement will be provided by—" He paused, looking at his notes with barely concealed amazement. "By volunteer patrol fleets under human coordination." In the observation gallery, Captain Jinwoo watched the proceedings with satisfaction. His converted freighter had become the flagship of what the media was calling the Guardian Fleet, a collection of ships from dozens of species dedicated to protecting children throughout the galaxy. The fleet had grown beyond anything he had imagined. What started as a desperate rescue mission had become a permanent force that operated with the unofficial blessing of governments throughout known space. Even the Hegemony had quietly provided funding and intelligence support. Beside him, Dr. Yuna reviewed reports from rehabilitation centers across human space. The children rescued from the slave markets were healing, but slowly. Some still woke up screaming from nightmares. Others couldn't be left alone without panicking. "How are our kids doing?" Jinwoo asked. "Better," Yuna replied. "Jihoon is back, in school and designing improvements to his colony's defense systems. Mina wants to study diplomacy. She says she wants to make sure something like this never happens to other children." "And little Doyun?" She smiled. "He's applied to join the defense fleet when he's old enough." The children who had been taken from New Terra had become symbols of resistance and recovery throughout the galaxy. Their courage during captivity and their resilience afterward had inspired countless others to speak out against injustice. But they had also changed, marked by experiences no child should have to endure. On New Terra, Taehyung worked in his expanded engineering lab, now focused on developing better defense systems for frontier colonies. The attack on his world had taught humanity that isolation was no protection against those who preyed on the innocent. "Dad, look at this," Jihoon called from across the lab. At 9 years old, he was already showing an understanding of engineering, principles that amazed his teachers. But there was a seriousness to him now, a focus that came from having seen the dark side of the galaxy. "What is it, son?" "I've been thinking about early warning systems. If we had known the Vex High were coming, maybe we could have protected everyone." Taehyung put his arm around his boy's shoulders. Ji-hoon rarely talked about his time in captivity, but it had clearly affected how he saw the world. The innocent trust of childhood had been replaced by a determination to protect others from what he had experienced. "That's good thinking," Tae-hyung said. "Why don't you work on that design?" Across the galaxy, similar conversations were taking place. The children who had been rescued were growing up with a unique perspective on justice and protection. Many were already showing interest in careers that would help prevent future tragedies. Solgi had returned to her medical practice, but she now specialized in treating trauma victims. Her work with the rescued prisoners had taught her techniques that were helping beings throughout the sector recover from their ordeals. "The mind heals differently for each species," she explained to a gathering of medical professionals. "But there are common patterns. The most important thing is giving victims back their sense of control." She thought often of Mina, who had shown such leadership during their captivity. The girl was now 11 and already talking about following in Hana's footsteps as a diplomat. But unlike most diplomatic candidates, Mina had first-hand experience with the consequences of political failure. The trials of the captured slavers had become the most watched legal proceedings in galactic history. Captain Zephyk and his crew faced charges not just from human courts, but from every species whose children they had trafficked. The evidence was overwhelming: financial records, communication logs, and testimony from thousands of victims painted a picture of an operation that had operated with impunity for centuries. "You treated children like property," the presiding judge said during sentencing. "You stole innocence and sold it to the highest bidder. The court finds no possibility of redemption for crimes of this magnitude." Zephyk and his surviving crew were sentenced to life imprisonment on a penal world where they would spend their remaining years performing the same hard labor they had forced on their victims. It was justice, but it felt inadequate given the scope of their crimes. More important than individual punishment was the systematic destruction of the slave trade network. Human investigation teams, working with law enforcement from dozens of worlds, had identified and eliminated over 2,000 criminal organizations involved in trafficking. The economic impact was staggering. Entire industries that had depended on slave labor collapsed overnight. Some corporations that had unknowingly purchased products made by trafficked workers lost billions in canceled contracts and boycotts. But new industries emerged to fill the void. Companies that could prove ethical sourcing found themselves with more business than they could handle. Worlds that had been excluded from galactic trade due to their anti-slavery stance suddenly became preferred partners. Crime boss Thexel, who had controlled the slave markets on Kepler Station, hadn't lived to see his trial. He had been found dead in his cell 3 days after his arrest, apparently killed by other prisoners who had learned of his crimes. The investigation was perfunctory. No one much cared how a slaver had died. But his death had sent a message throughout the galactic underworld. Trafficking in children was no longer a profitable business. The risks had become too high, and the human response too unpredictable. Admiral Hyun-woo stood on the bridge of his flagship, reviewing patrol reports from the Guardian fleet. In the 6 months since the Vex-High were eliminated, attempted child trafficking had dropped by over 90% throughout known space. "It's not just fear," his intelligence chief reported. "It's the knowledge that humans will cross the galaxy to protect their young. And now that other species have seen what coordinated action can accomplish, they're organizing their own protection networks." The human example had inspired a galactic movement. Species that had been victims for centuries were learning to fight back. Governments that had been too corrupt or weak to protect their citizens were being replaced by leaders who understood that some things were worth any sacrifice. But perhaps the most significant change was in how other species viewed humanity itself. Ambassador. Korath of the Drakmir visited New Terra as part of a diplomatic mission to study human social structures. What he found challenged every assumption his people had made about this relatively young species. Your response to the crisis was unprecedented, he told Tae-hyung during a tour of the rebuilt colony. Most species would have petitioned their governments, filed complaints with the council, perhaps organized economic sanctions, but you mobilized your entire civilization for war. Not war, Tae-hyung corrected. Rescue. There's a difference. Is there? Korath asked. You destroyed an entire criminal network. You overthrew governments that supported slavery. You fundamentally altered the balance of power in this sector of the galaxy. Tae-hyung considered this. I suppose we did, but we didn't set out to change the galaxy. We just wanted our children back. And that, Korath replied, is what makes humanity so dangerous. You don't seek power for its own sake, but when your core values are threatened, you become unstoppable. The conversation was being repeated throughout the galaxy as other species tried to understand what they had witnessed. The humans hadn't conquered territory or demanded tribute. They had simply made it clear that certain behaviors would not be tolerated. As the first anniversary of the New Terra incident approached, the rescued children gathered for a reunion at the colony. They came from dozens of worlds where they had been relocated with their families. Some were thriving, others still struggled with their experiences, but all had been forever changed by what they had endured. Mina, now 12, had grown tall and confident. She spoke at the gathering about her plans to study galactic law and diplomacy. We can't prevent every tragedy, she said to the assembled crowd of children, parents, and rescuers. But we can make sure that when bad things happen, good people are ready to act. Do-hyun, despite being the youngest of the original captives, had become something of a celebrity. His courage during the escape had been featured in news reports throughout human space. But at 8 years old, he was more interested in playing with his friends than discussing galactic